The girl burst out of the school bathroom, her cries echoing through the empty hallway. Tears streamed down her face, her small hands trembling as she clutched the hem of her skirt. She was breathing hard, like she had been running for her life. Jim Carter, the school janitor, had been mopping the floors just around the corner when he heard the sound. He turned quickly, his heart pounding as he saw the terrified girl rush straight towards him. "Help me," she sobbed, grabbing his arm with desperate fingers. Jim bent down, steadying her. "What happened?" he asked gently. Before she could answer, heavy footsteps echoed from inside the bathroom. Jim's eyes darted to the slightly open door. He could see a shadow moving inside. And then, the principal stepped out. His face was cold, his jaw tight, and his eyes sharp as they landed on Jim and the girl. His hands were clenched at his sides. His neatly pressed suit was slightly wrinkled, like he had been struggling with something. With someone. Jim felt his stomach drop. "What are you doing here, janitor?" the principal asked, his voice deep and full of something dark. Jim didn't answer. His mind was racing. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. He could feel it. The girl still clutched his sleeve, her fingers digging into the fabric. She was shaking all over. Jim turned back to the bathroom, to the shadowy stalls and the silent walls. Something had happened in there. Something bad. And Jim Carter was going to find out exactly what it was. That morning, Jim had arrived at Hillcrest Academy for what was supposed to be an ordinary workday. He had been working there for only 2 days, but something about the school felt strange. He couldn't explain it, but there was an uneasiness in the air. He had noticed it on his first day. The way the teachers whispered among themselves, the odd looks some students gave each other, and most of all, the way the principal carried himself. There was something about the man that made Jim uncomfortable, something in his stiff posture and the way his eyes scanned the hallways like a hunter watching prey. Jim had worked at many places in his life, hotels, schools, hospitals, but never had he felt so out of place. Maybe it was because he was the only black staff member. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something deeper. That morning, as he pushed his cleaning cart down the empty hallway, he saw a young girl sitting alone on a bench outside the classroom doors. She was small, no older than 9, with curly black hair tied into neat ponytails. Her backpack was beside her, untouched. She was staring at the ground, her fingers fiddling with a torn piece of paper. Jim paused. He had seen her before, Maya. He remembered her because she always seemed separate. She didn't play with the other kids at recess. She walked alone, ate alone, and left alone. She looked up at him. "Hey there," Jim said kindly. "Why aren't you in class?" Maya hesitated, then glanced toward the classroom door. Jim followed her gaze and saw a few students staring at her from the window. When they saw him looking, they quickly turned away. Jim's stomach twisted. He had seen that look before, the look of children who knew something, who had done something. "Did something happen?" he asked. Maya shook her head quickly. I'm just late," she mumbled, gripping the straps of her backpack tightly. Jim knew that wasn't the truth. Before he could say anything else, the door to the principal's office swung open. Out stepped Principal Robinson. His sharp eyes scanned the hallway before landing on Maya. His lips pressed into a thin line. "You're late again," he said in a low voice. Maya immediately shrank back. Jim stood still, watching. Something in the way the principal spoke made his skin crawl. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Then, to Jim's shock, the principal grabbed Maya's wrist. "Come with me," he ordered, pulling her toward his office. Maya didn't resist. She didn't even speak. She just lowered her head and followed. Jim clenched his jaw. Every part of him told him to stop the principal right there. But what could he do? He was just the janitor. He watched as the door to the principal's office closed behind them. Something was very, very wrong. Jim spent the next hour trying to focus on his work. He cleaned the classrooms, mopped the cafeteria, emptied the trash bins. But his mind kept drifting back to Maya. He passed by her classroom again and peeked inside. She wasn't there. Jim's grip on the mop tightened. Where was she? It wasn't until later, when he was cleaning near the bathrooms, that he finally got his answer. It started with a scream, a loud, sharp, terrified scream from inside the girls' bathroom. Jim's entire body froze. Then came the sound of running footsteps. And then Maya burst through the door. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with horror. Tears ran down her cheeks. Jim barely had time to react before she grabbed onto his sleeve, her small hands trembling. "Help me," she sobbed. And then, seconds later, Principal Robinson stepped out. Jim's blood ran cold. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his breathing uneven. His hands were clenched. Jim knew. Something had happened in that bathroom. Something awful. The principal's eyes locked onto Jim's. And for the first time since arriving at Hillcrest Academy, Jim Carter felt fear. Jim tightened his grip on his mop. Whatever was happening in this school, it ended today. The hallway fell into dead silence as Jim stood face to face with Principal Robinson. The only sound was Maya's shaky breathing as she clung tightly to Jim's sleeve, her small fingers digging into his arm. Jim didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't back down. Something had happened in that bathroom. Something terrible. The principal's cold eyes flicked between Jim and Maya. He knew. Jim knew. But the man didn't look scared. No, he looked angry. "Let go of her," Jim said, his voice low but firm. The principal let out a sharp breath through his nose, his lips curling into something ugly. "This is none of your business, janitor," he said, taking a slow step forward. "Go back to your cleaning." Jim's muscles tensed. He felt Maya tremble beside him, her fingers gripping tighter, silently begging him not to leave her. "I said let go of her," Jim repeated, stepping in front of Maya. The principal's face twisted into a sneer. "You think you can challenge me?" he scoffed. "You're nothing here. A janitor. Hired help. I don't need to explain myself to you." Jim didn't flinch. He knew the principal was trying to intimidate him. But Jim had seen men like him before. Men who thought power meant control, who thought fear kept people silent. Jim had stayed silent for too long. But not today. Not when a child was involved. Maya's breathing was still quick and panicked behind him. Jim knew he had to get her out of here fast. Then, suddenly, the bathroom door creaked open. Jim's eyes darted to the doorway. A second girl stepped out. A small, blonde-haired student, her face pale, her eyes wide. She looked terrified. Jim recognized her. Michelle, the bully from Maya's class. She stood there frozen, staring at the principal like she had just seen something horrible. Jim's stomach dropped. She saw something. She knew. But before Michelle could say anything, the principal's head snapped toward her. His expression turned dangerous. "Go back to class," he ordered, his voice like ice. Michelle flinched, but she didn't move. Jim saw it. The hesitation, the fear. She didn't want to go. But the principal's eyes darkened. His jaw clenched. And just like that, Michelle spun on her heels and ran. Jim's heart sank. The principal still had control over these kids. They were afraid of him, and that made Jim even angrier. "Let's go, Maya," Jim said, keeping his voice calm for her sake. He turned away from the principal, ready to get her somewhere safe. But then, the principal grabbed Jim's shoulder. Hard. "Where do you think you're going?" Jim whipped around, knocking the principal's hand off him. And in that moment, Jim saw it. The rage. The hatred. Principal Robinson wanted to hurt him. And Jim wasn't about to let that happen. Maya let out a small whimper, pressing closer to Jim's side. Jim took a deep breath. Then, loud and clear, he said, "I'm taking Maya to the school nurse. And if you lay a hand on me again, I swear to God, I will make sure you regret it." The principal's face twisted in fury. But before he could react, a voice echoed down the hallway. "What's going on here?" Jim turned. A teacher stood at the end of the corridor. It was Miss Freya Luna, Maya's homeroom teacher. Her sharp eyes flicked between Jim, Maya, and the principal. Jim didn't miss the way she looked at the principal, like she was wary of him, like she didn't quite trust him. For the first time, Jim felt hope. Maybe he wasn't alone in this. The principal forced a tight smile. "Nothing, Miss Freya," he said smoothly, his voice suddenly calm, like he hadn't just been filled with rage. "Maya was misbehaving again. I was just handling it." Miss Freya's eyes narrowed slightly. Jim saw it. She didn't believe him, but she also looked scared to challenge him. Jim clenched his fists. The principal had power over the teachers, too. Miss Freya hesitated. Then she turned to Jim. Mr. Carter, she said, why don't you take Maya to the nurse? Jim didn't need to be told twice. He nodded and started walking away, keeping Maya close. But just before they turned the corner, Jim glanced back. The principal was still standing there, his face stone cold. But this time, Jim saw something else in his eyes. Fear. Not fear of Jim. Fear of what Maya might say. And in that moment, Jim knew. This wasn't the first time something had happened. And unless someone stopped him, it wouldn't be the last. Jim tightened his grip on Maya's hand. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The school nurse's office was quiet when Jim and Maya stepped inside. The nurse, a kind-looking woman named Miss Florence, turned toward them. Her face immediately softened when she saw Maya's tear-streaked cheeks. "Oh, honey," she said, crouching down to Maya's level. "What happened?" Maya didn't answer. She just stared at the floor, her hands clutched in her lap. Jim felt his heart ache. The girl was scared to speak. Jim turned to Miss Florence. "She was in the bathroom with Principal Robinson," he said quietly. "Something happened." The nurse's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't ask questions. She just nodded and gently took Maya's hands in hers. "You're safe now," she said softly. "No one will hurt you here." Jim saw it, the tiny breath of relief that escaped Maya's lips. It wasn't much, but it was something. Miss Florence checked Maya over, carefully inspecting her arms, her hands, and her face. Jim watched as she paused when she saw faint red marks on Maya's wrist. Jim's blood ran cold. The principal had grabbed her. Hard. Miss Florence's lips pressed into a thin line. She turned to Jim. "Someone needs to report this," she said. "This isn't right." Jim nodded. "I'll do it," he said. Miss Florence hesitated. Then she reached for something in her desk. A notepad. "Here," she said, handing it to Maya. "If you're not ready to talk, you can write it down." Maya stared at the paper for a long moment. Then slowly she picked up the pencil. Jim watched as her small hands started writing. His stomach twisted as the words appeared on the page. "He told me I don't belong here." Jim felt his fists clench. This man needed to be stopped. Miss Florence read the words too. She looked up at Jim, and before she could speak, the door burst open. Jim turned, and standing there, face red with fury, was Principal Robinson. The nurse's office fell silent as Principal Robinson stood in the doorway, his eyes locked onto Jim and Maya like a predator spotting its prey. His face was flushed with rage, but his lips curled into a forced smile, the kind that hid something dangerous beneath. Jim instinctively stepped in front of Maya, blocking the principal's view of her. Miss Florence stiffened beside them, her hand tightening on the notepad where Maya had just written those chilling words. "He told me I don't belong here." Jim saw the principal's eyes flicker to the notepad. He knew. He knew Maya had written something, and he wasn't about to let that slip. "What's going on here?" Principal Robinson's voice was calm, but Jim could hear the thinly veiled threat underneath. Miss Florence folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "I was just checking Maya for injuries," she said, keeping her tone polite but firm. "It seems she's had a rough morning." The principal's smile didn't falter, but his eyes turned sharp. "There was no need for that," he said smoothly. "Maya was simply misbehaving in class, and I had to discipline her. Nothing more." Jim felt a sharp wave of disgust. The way he said it, as if hurting a child was just part of his job, made Jim's stomach turn. Maya gripped Jim's sleeve tighter, shrinking behind him. Jim took a slow breath and spoke, keeping his voice steady. "With all due respect, sir," he said, "discipline doesn't involve dragging a child into the bathroom and making her cry." The principal's eyes darkened. Jim knew he had just crossed a line. For a long moment, no one moved. Miss Florence looked between them, sensing the tension. She gently placed a hand on Maya's shoulder, as if reassuring her that she wasn't alone. Then the principal stepped forward. His smile disappeared. "You're overstepping, Carter," he said in a low, warning tone. "You're a janitor. You clean floors. You don't interfere in school matters." Jim held his ground. "I don't care about my job," he said. "I care about this child." The principal's jaw clenched. His fingers curled into tight fists at his sides. Jim knew what was happening. The man was losing control. Then, the principal's gaze shifted. He looked straight at Miss Florence. "You will give me that notepad," he ordered, his voice sharp as a knife. "Right now." Jim felt Maya tense behind him. Miss Florence's lips parted slightly, as if she was debating what to do. For a moment, everything hung in the balance. Then, she slowly tore the page from the notepad, folding it neatly. Jim's heart pounded. The principal smirked, as if he thought he had won. But then, Miss Florence did something unexpected. She handed the folded note, not to the principal, but to Jim. Jim took it, his fingers curling around the small piece of paper. Principal Robinson's face changed instantly. The smirk vanished. For the first time, Jim saw genuine panic in his eyes. The principal lunged forward. "Give me that," he snarled. But Jim was faster. He dodged, shoving the note deep into his pocket. Maya let out a small gasp as the principal's hand swiped through empty air. Miss Florence took a sharp step in front of him, blocking his path. "Enough!" she snapped. The principal's chest rose and fell quickly as he glared at them all, his face twisted with pure hatred. Then, in a low, furious whisper, he said, "You made a mistake, Carter." Jim's pulse raced. But before he could respond, the principal turned on his heel and stormed out. The door slammed shut behind him, making Maya flinch. A heavy silence settled over the room. Jim let out a slow breath. His fingers curled around the note in his pocket, feeling the weight of everything that just happened. Miss Florence finally spoke. "That man is dangerous," she said. Jim nodded. "I know." Maya rubbed her eyes, still sniffling. "Is Izzy going to come back?" she whispered. Jim crouched down beside her, his voice gentle but firm. "He won't touch you again," he promised. "Not while I'm here." Miss Florence exhaled, rubbing her temples. "We need to do something," she muttered. "The school board, the police, someone." Jim pulled the note out and unfolded it slowly. He stared at Maya's shaky handwriting. "He told me I don't belong here." Jim felt his anger build again. This wasn't just about one incident. This was systemic. And if the principal had gotten away with this for so long, what else had he done? Jim's mind raced. He needed a plan. Before he could speak, Miss Florence grabbed his arm suddenly. "Wait," she whispered. "Do you hear that?" Jim froze. There was a noise outside the office. Footsteps. Heavy ones. Maya gripped his sleeve. And then, a loud thud against the door. Jim and Miss Florence both jumped. Then, another thud, like someone trying to force their way in. Maya let out a small whimper, curling into herself. Jim's blood ran cold. He knew exactly who was on the other side. And this time, Principal Robinson wasn't pretending to be calm anymore. The door rattled as another heavy blow struck it. Jim stood protectively in front of Maya, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. Miss Florence backed away, clutching the edge of her desk. Then came the voice. "Principal Robinson, I know you're in there, Carter." His voice was low, controlled, but it carried a dangerous edge, like a predator circling its prey. Maya gripped Jim's sleeve tighter. Her small body trembled against him. Miss Florence's face was pale. She hurried to the door and locked it. Click. Silence. Then a slow knock. Tap. 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 "I won't ask again." The principal's voice came softer this time, but it was no less threatening. "Open this door." Jim exchanged a glance with Miss Florence. She shook her head rapidly, whispering, "Don't." Jim didn't plan to. He stepped back, pressing a hand to Maya's shoulder. "Stay behind me," he whispered. Then he called out, his voice firm. "You need to leave, sir. You're scaring the child." Silence. Then, a chilling laugh. "I don't think you understand," the principal said, his voice slow and deliberate. "I run this school, and I don't take orders from janitors." Jim felt his anger rise, but he stayed calm. "You're not in charge of this room," he said. "Miss Florence is, and she wants you to leave." A long pause. Then, the handle turned. Jim's muscles tensed as he saw the knob jiggle violently. The lock held. Another pause. And then, in a voice so cold it sent a chill down Jim's spine, the principal whispered, "You don't know what you're doing, Carter. You're making a mistake." Jim clenched his fists. "The only mistake was letting you near these kids," he shot back. The principal didn't respond. Then his footsteps faded away. Jim listened carefully. He waited. 10 seconds. 20. Nothing. Miss Florence exhaled shakily. Jim turned to Maya. She was pale, her eyes still glistening with fear. Jim crouched beside her. "Hey," he said gently. "It's okay now. He's gone." Maya nodded weakly, but she didn't look convinced. Jim knew better than to tell her not to be scared. He was scared too. Miss Florence ran a shaky hand through her hair. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Jim stood up. "We report this," he said. "To the police." Miss Florence hesitated. "The school board." Jim shook his head. "No," he said. "Not just them. This isn't just about a complaint. That man is dangerous. We need to go outside of the school. Someone higher. Someone who can actually stop him." Miss Florence swallowed. She knew he was right. But before she could answer, a sharp scream rang out from the hallway. Maya flinched. Jim whirled around. Then came another scream. A child. And then a loud crash. Jim didn't think. He ran to the door, unlocked it, and yanked it open. The hallway was chaos. A group of students stood frozen near the lockers, their eyes wide with terror. A chair was overturned. A girl was on the floor, clutching her wrist. And standing over her, Principal Robinson. His face was red with fury, his hands still raised. Jim's blood went ice cold. The girl on the floor was Michelle, the same girl who had walked out of the bathroom earlier, the one who had seen something. Jim's heart pounded. The principal had attacked her. The students were too scared to move. And then Principal Robinson turned. His eyes landed on Jim. And in that moment, Jim knew something. The principal wasn't going to stop. Not unless someone stopped him. Jim stepped forward. He wasn't afraid anymore. This ended today. Jim stepped into the hallway, his fists clenched, his heart pounding. Principal Robinson stood over Michelle, his face twisted in fury, his hands still raised from where he had just struck her. The students were frozen in place, their faces pale with fear. And then Michelle let out a small, shaky sob. Jim's rage exploded. "You put your hands on a child?" Jim's voice was deadly quiet, but it carried through the hallway like a clap of thunder. The principal turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Jim's. For the first time, he looked shaken. "I don't know what you think you saw," Robinson said smoothly, trying to regain control, "but this girl was being disruptive." You were what?" Jim took another step forward. "Hitting her? Threatening her? Like you did with Maya?" The principal's face flashed with something dangerous. "You're out of line, Carter." Jim ignored him. Instead, he bent down to Michelle, keeping his voice gentle. "Are you hurt?" Michelle nodded, sniffling. She clutched her wrist, her small body trembling. Jim's heart ached for her. He knew what it felt like to be small in a world that wanted to crush you. "Come on," he said softly, offering his hand. Michelle hesitated. Then she took it. Jim helped her to her feet. And when she turned, her wide eyes filled with tears, she looked at Principal Robinson and spoke. "I saw what you did in the bathroom," she whispered. "I saw what you did to Maya." The hallway fell deathly silent. Jim felt his stomach drop. The principal's face turned ghostly pale. Then his eyes darkened. "You," he whispered. And before Jim could react, Principal Robinson lunged, straight for Michelle. Jim moved on instinct. He grabbed Michelle and yanked her back, shielding her behind him. The principal's hand swiped through empty air. Jim's rage exploded. His voice boomed through the hallway. "Don't touch her." The principal froze. The students let out small gasps, staring in shock. Jim felt his breathing heavy, his entire body tense. And then a teacher stepped into the hallway. Miss Freya. She took one look at the scene. Jim protecting Michelle, the principal standing in fury, the terror in the kid's eyes. Her face hardened. "What is going on here?" she demanded. The principal opened his mouth, then stopped. Jim saw it. For the first time, doubt in the man's face. He was losing control. Miss Freya turned to Jim. "What happened?" Before Jim could speak, Michelle stepped forward. Her small voice cut through the silence. "He hit me," she said, "and he hurt Maya." Miss Freya's entire body stiffened. She turned back to the principal, her eyes blazing. "Is this true?" The principal scoffed. Of course not. But before he could finish, a sharp voice rang through the air. I saw it too. Jim turned. A boy had stepped forward. Another student. And then another. One by one, more students stepped forward. I saw it too, one whispered. He grabbed Maya. He told her she didn't belong. He always scares us. Jim felt his chest tighten. These kids had been afraid for so long. But now, they weren't alone. And for the first time, neither was he. Principal Robinson staggered back. Jim saw it, the panic creeping into his face. He had lost control. And then, the sound of sirens filled the air. Jim's breath hitched. Someone had called the police. And this time, there was no way out for Principal Robinson. The police sirens grew louder, echoing through the school hallways like a final warning. Principal Robinson's face drained of color. His eyes darted from Jim to Miss Freya to the growing number of students speaking against him. For the first time, he looked trapped. Jim stepped forward, standing tall. It's over, he said. You don't run this school anymore. The principal's jaw clenched so tightly Jim thought his teeth might crack. His hands curled into fists. But he didn't speak. He knew it too. Footsteps thundered down the hall, and 4 police officers appeared, their uniforms crisp, their faces unreadable. The moment they entered, the entire hallway went silent. Miss Freya stepped forward, her voice steady. Officers, she said, this man, Principal Robinson, has been physically harming students. One of the officers turned to Michelle, who was still clutching her wrist. Are you hurt? He asked gently. Michelle nodded, tears in her eyes. Jim felt his stomach twist in anger all over again. She's not the only one, Jim said. Maya. She was in the bathroom with him earlier. At the sound of Maya's name, Principal Robinson finally snapped. That's enough, he bellowed, his face twisting in rage. The entire hallway flinched, but the police officers didn't. Instead, one of them calmly reached for his handcuffs. You need to come with us, sir. The principal's breath hitched. He took one step back, then another. Then, he turned to run. But Jim moved first. With quick reflexes, Jim blocked his path, stepping in front of him. Principal Robinson stumbled, glaring at Jim with pure hatred. You think you've won? He spat. You think this will change anything? You're nothing, Carter. Nothing. Jim didn't even blink. I'm enough to stop you, he said. Before the principal could respond, the officers grabbed him. One of them forced his arms behind his back as the cold metal of the handcuffs snapped into place. A gasp rippled through the students. Jim saw the shock on their faces. For so long, this man had been untouchable. But not anymore. Jim turned to Maya, who was standing near Miss Florence. She was watching everything, and for the first time since he met her, he saw something new in her eyes. Hope. The officers began leading Principal Robinson away. But just before he was out of sight, he turned to Jim one last time and whispered so quietly only Jim could hear. This isn't over. Jim felt a chill run down his spine. Then the principal was gone. The hallway erupted into whispers. Miss Freya turned to the students. All of you, back to your classrooms, she said. Everything is under control. The students hesitated, as if they couldn't believe what they had just seen. But slowly, they obeyed. Miss Florence walked over to Jim, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. You did it, she murmured. Jim shook his head. We did it. Maya stepped forward. She looked up at Jim, her big brown eyes filled with something unreadable. Then, she hugged him. Jim's heart clenched. He knelt down, his voice gentle. You're safe now, Maya, he promised. No one will hurt you again. Maya nodded. But Jim knew this wasn't over. Principal Robinson might have been arrested, but the darkness in this school ran deeper than just one man. And Jim Carter wasn't going to stop until he made things right. The moment Principal Robinson was dragged out of the school in handcuffs, the hallways erupted into whispers, gasps, and hurried conversations. Jim felt the weight on his chest lessen slightly, but only for a moment. He knew this wasn't truly over. Because the school, the very walls of Hillcrest Academy, had been built on silence. And silence was dangerous. Maya still clung to his sleeve, her small hands shaking slightly. Miss Freya sighed, rubbing her temples. "This is going to be a mess," she muttered. "The board, the parents, the media." Jim exhaled slowly. "Good." Miss Freya blinked. "Good." "Yes," Jim said. "People need to know." Miss Florence nodded in agreement. But before they could say anything else, a deep voice echoed from behind them. "You shouldn't have done that, Carter." Jim turned and saw a group of teachers standing at the end of the hallway. They weren't clapping. They weren't celebrating. They were staring at him, and their faces were unreadable. Jim felt a cold wave of unease wash over him. One teacher, Mr. Evans, a history teacher, stepped forward. His arms were crossed. His expression was blank. "You think you saved the school?" he asked. Jim stiffened. "I think I stopped a man who was hurting kids," he said. Mr. Evans tilted his head. "Did you? Or did you just destroy the school's reputation?" Jim's blood ran cold. "That man was a criminal," he said. "You saw what he did." Mr. Evans's eyes darkened. "I saw a principal being taken away in handcuffs," he said. "And now, parents will start asking questions. Sponsors will pull their money. The school board will come down on us. You didn't fix anything, Carter. You just brought chaos." Jim's fingers curled into fists. Miss Freya stepped forward. "Chaos," she snapped. "Are you listening to yourself? A child was hurt. Multiple children were hurt. And you're worried about funding?" Mr. Evans didn't blink. "Yes." Jim felt sick. Some of the other teachers nodded in agreement. Some looked guilty, and others just looked afraid, because Principal Robinson might have been arrested, but that didn't mean his supporters were gone. Jim swallowed the rage rising in his chest. "You can keep protecting monsters," he said, his voice like steel. "But I won't." Then, before anyone else could say a word, he turned and walked away. Maya followed him without hesitation. Miss Florence and Miss Freya exchanged glances, then followed too. Jim's mind raced. This school had been hiding the truth for too long, and now that the principal was gone, the real fight was about to begin. Jim, Miss Florence, and Miss Freya brought Maya back to the nurse's office. She was exhausted. Jim could see it in the way her small shoulders sagged, the way her hands trembled when she reached for a tissue. Miss Florence knelt beside her, her voice soft. "Maya," she said, "I know you've been through a lot, but can you tell us everything? Everything the principal said to you?" Maya hesitated. Then, she nodded. She grabbed a pen and paper from the desk, took a deep breath, and started writing. Jim and the teachers waited in silence. Maya's hands moved slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. When she finished, she handed the paper to Jim. Jim took it carefully. Then he read it, and his stomach dropped. I wasn't the only one. Jim's breath caught in his throat. Miss Freya peered over his shoulder, her eyes widening. Miss Florence whispered, "What does it say?" Jim looked up, his heart pounding. "It wasn't just Maya," he said. His voice was low, steady. The room fell into silence. Miss Florence's face paled. "You mean?" Jim nodded. The principal hadn't just hurt Maya. He had hurt other students too. And Maya knew their names. Jim's hands tightened around the paper. He turned to Miss Florence. "Give me the contact information for the parents of these kids," he said. Miss Florence nodded immediately and rushed to her desk. Miss Freya's hands shook slightly. "If this is true, then..." "It is," Jim said firmly. "Maya wouldn't lie about this." Miss Freya swallowed hard. Then, a knock sounded on the door. Jim turned, his body still on high alert. Miss Florence stepped forward and opened it. Standing outside were two police officers. Jim felt his pulse jump. "Mr. Carter?" one of them asked. Jim nodded. The officer's face was unreadable. "We need you to come with us." Jim's blood turned cold. Miss Freya's eyes widened. "What? Why?" The second officer sighed. "The principal has filed a countercomplaint. He's claiming that Jim was violent toward him and incited a student riot." Jim's jaw tightened. He should have seen this coming. Principal Robinson wasn't done yet. And now, he was trying to take Jim down with him. Jim felt the weight of the officer's words settle over him like a heavy chain. A countercomplaint. Principal Robinson was trying to turn the system against him. Miss Freya took a sharp step forward, her voice laced with anger. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "Jim didn't do anything wrong. We all saw what the principal did to the children." The officers exchanged a glance. "We're not making any arrests," one of them said. "We just need Mr. Carter to come down to the station and answer some questions." Jim took a deep breath. He had a choice. He could fight, argue, or he could go willingly because he had nothing to hide. He turned to Maya. Her eyes were wide with fear. Jim knelt beside her, his voice gentle. "I'll be back, okay? Don't be scared." Maya hesitated. Then she nodded. Jim rose to his feet and turned to the officers. "Let's go." At the police station, Jim sat in a cold, gray interrogation room. A metal table, a flickering light overhead. The air smelled of stale coffee and cheap disinfectant. He had been in rooms like this before, not as a suspect, but as a black man who knew how quickly things could go wrong. The door creaked open, and a detective walked in. He was middle-aged, tired-looking, but his gaze was sharp. He took a seat across from Jim and folded his hands. "Tell me everything," he said. Jim did. He told him about Maya, about Michelle, about the bathroom, about the hallway attack. The detective listened without interrupting. When Jim finished, the man leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. "You're saying this principal had been abusing students for years?" "Yes," Jim said firmly. "And the school covered for him." The detective exhaled slowly. Then he slid a folder across the table. Jim frowned. Picking it up, he opened it, and his stomach dropped. Inside were documents, reports, complaints, not from Maya, from other parents, other students. Jim's hands tightened around the papers. "This," his voice was a whisper, "this was already reported?" The detective nodded. "And every time, the complaints disappeared." Jim's blood ran cold. Hillcrest Academy hadn't just protected Robinson. They had buried the truth. Jim looked up, his pulse pounding. "So, why was nothing done?" The detective's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because Robinson had connections," he said. "School board officials, local politicians." He kept himself protected. Jim gritted his teeth. This man had gotten away with it for years. But now, Jim had exposed him, and Robinson was fighting back. The detective closed the file. "We need more," he said. "We need undeniable proof." Jim's mind raced. Then he remembered the note, Maya's list of names. He looked at the detective, his eyes burning with determination. "I can get you more," Jim said. The detective raised an eyebrow. Jim leaned forward. "Give me one night," he said. "I'll bring you everything you need." The detective hesitated. Then he nodded. "You got one night, Carter." When Jim returned to Hillcrest Academy, the mood had shifted. Students whispered. Teachers avoided his gaze. Some staff members looked angry. Others terrified. Word had spread. Jim had shaken the foundation of the school. But he wasn't done yet. He pushed open the nurse's office door. Miss Florence and Miss Freya were there, along with Maya. The little girl jumped up the moment she saw him. "You're back," she said, relief flooding her face. Jim knelt beside her, giving her a reassuring nod. "I need your help," he said. "We need to find the other kids. The ones who were hurt, like you." Maya's smile faded. Then she nodded. Miss Florence spoke up. "I already pulled the files of the students she mentioned," she said. "But some of them, they're gone." Jim frowned. "Gone?" Miss Florence's voice tightened. "Their families pulled them out of school," she said. "Some without warning. No explanations." Jim's stomach twisted. This went deeper than he thought. Miss Freya crossed her arms. "If we can track down those families, we'll have our proof." Jim nodded. Then a knock at the door. They all turned. Eileen, the school receptionist, stood in the doorway. She looked pale, nervous. Jim stood. "Eileen." She swallowed hard. Then she held out a flash drive. Jim took it confused. "What is this?" Eileen's voice shook. "It's the security footage from the school cameras," she whispered. "From the last 5 years." Jim's heart stopped. Miss Florence gasped. Miss Freya's eyes widened. And Maya grabbed onto Jim's sleeve. Eileen took a shaky breath. "I was too scared to say anything before," she said. "But after what happened today, I can't stay quiet anymore." Jim gripped the flash drive. This was it, the evidence they needed. But before he could even thank Eileen, the door to the office burst open. Jim spun around, and standing there, his face twisted in rage, was a member of the school board. He was furious. "You've done enough, Carter," he spat. "It's time for you to go." Jim didn't move. The man's eyes flickered to the flash drive in Jim's hands. And for the first time, Jim saw fear in them. They knew. They all knew. And they were desperate to shut him up. Jim tightened his grip. This fight wasn't over. It was just getting started. Jim stared down the school board member, gripping the flash drive tightly. He could see it in the man's eyes, fear. Not fear of Jim. Fear of the truth. "You need to leave," the board member repeated, his voice shaking slightly. "Now." Jim stood his ground. "I don't think so," he said, his voice even. "Not when I just got my hands on this." He held up the flash drive. The board member's expression darkened. "That footage is school property," he snapped. "You have no right to it." Jim let out a cold laugh. "No right," he echoed. "This school let a man like Robinson run wild for years. You let kids suffer while you protected him." The board member stiffened. Miss Freya stepped up beside Jim. "You knew, didn't you?" she said, her voice laced with disgust. "You knew about everything, and you kept it quiet." The board member's jaw tightened. "This is bigger than just one man," he said. "Hillcrest Academy has a reputation to protect. You don't understand how things work." Jim's stomach churned. He had heard that line before. Too many times. People like this, they never cared about victims. They cared about power, money, image. Jim stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Well, let me make something clear," he said. "That reputation, that power, it's about to come crashing down." The board member's face twisted in anger. But before he could speak, a voice interrupted. "Jim?" Jim turned. Maya stood behind him, clutching Miss Florence's hand. The little girl's eyes were wide with fear. Jim's heart ached. She had been through enough. He looked back at the board member. "You need to move," Jim said. "Right now." The man's hands curled into fists. Then he stepped aside. Jim wasted no time. He turned, grabbing Maya's hand gently. "Let's go," he murmured. Maya nodded. Miss Freya and Miss Florence followed. As Jim walked past the board member, he leaned in close. "This school won't cover this up," he whispered. Then he walked away. Jim's heart pounded as they hurried through the hallways. They needed to get out of the school, get to the police station. They had proof, and now they had to protect it. Miss Freya spoke, her voice low but urgent. "The moment they realize what we have, they'll do anything to stop us." Jim knew she was right. This wasn't just about Principal Robinson anymore. It was about everyone who had protected him. The school board, the teachers who stayed silent, the sponsors who turned a blind eye. This was bigger than Jim had ever imagined. Miss Florence suddenly grabbed Jim's arm. "Wait," she said. "We can't all go. If they try to stop us again, we need a backup plan." Jim hesitated. Then he nodded. Miss Florence turned to Miss Freya. "You stay here with Maya," she said. "Keep her safe. If anything happens to Jim, you take this drive straight to the police yourself." Miss Freya nodded, gripping Maya's shoulders. Maya's lip trembled. "Be careful, Jim," she whispered. Jim knelt down beside her, his voice soft. "I will," he promised. Then he stood up. Miss Florence grabbed her car keys. "Let's go." Jim and Miss Florence hurried to the parking lot. The moment they stepped outside, Jim felt the tension in the air. Something was wrong. Then he saw them. Two men in dark suits, standing near the school gates. Jim's stomach dropped. Miss Florence's grip on the keys tightened. "School board security," she murmured. Jim cursed under his breath. They knew, and they weren't going to let them leave. Miss Florence kept walking, her voice steady. "Get in the car. Now." Jim didn't hesitate. He climbed into the passenger seat. Miss Florence slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The security men began walking toward them. Jim's heart pounded. One of the men pulled out a phone. Jim knew exactly what was happening. They were calling someone, and if they didn't leave now, they might not leave at all. "Drive," Jim said. Miss Florence slammed her foot on the gas. The tires screeched as they peeled out of the parking lot. The security guard shouted something, but it was too late. They were gone. Miss Florence gripped the wheel, her knuckles white. Jim clutched the flash drive, his pulse still racing. "They're going to try to stop us," Miss Florence muttered. "They won't let this get out." Jim nodded. "But they can't stop the truth." Miss Florence took a sharp turn, heading toward the police station. Jim exhaled. This was it. They had everything they needed. And by the end of today, the entire world would know what Hillcrest Academy had been hiding. But then, Miss Florence's phone buzzed. She glanced at it. Then, her face went pale. Jim's stomach dropped. "What?" he asked. Miss Florence swallowed hard. Then, she turned the phone toward Jim. It was a news article, a headline in bold letters. "Janitor at Hillcrest Academy facing charges for assaulting principal." Jim's blood ran cold. They were framing him. Miss Florence gripped the wheel tighter. "This isn't just a cover-up," she said, her voice deadly serious. "They're trying to make you the villain." Jim's mind raced. The school board, the officials, the sponsors. They weren't just hiding the truth. They were trying to destroy him. Miss Florence pressed down on the gas, her voice firm. "We have to get to the police first, before they turn everyone against you." Jim gritted his teeth. He had known this wouldn't be easy. But now, it was war. And Jim Carter wasn't backing down. Jim's hands tightened around the flash drive as Miss Florence sped down the highway toward the police station. The weight of what was happening pressed down on him like a heavy chain. They were framing him, not just covering up the truth. They were turning him into the villain. His picture was in the article. His name was bold and damning. Janitor assaults principal. Incites student riots. Endangers children. Jim's chest burned with anger. They were painting him as the bad guy. "Those bastards," Miss Florence muttered, gripping the wheel. "They're trying to ruin you." Jim exhaled through his nose, his mind racing. "We need to get ahead of this," he said. "If the cops see that article before we give them the proof, they might not believe us," Miss Florence finished. Jim nodded grimly. This was a race against time. The police, the school board, the media, they were all pieces on the board. And if Jim didn't move fast, he would lose everything. Then Miss Florence's phone rang. She put it on speaker. A frantic voice filled the car. "Jim, it's Miss Freya. You need to come back. Now." Jim's stomach dropped. "What happened?" "Maya's gone." The world stopped. Jim's breath caught in his throat. "What?" "She was with me in the nurse's office." Miss Freya rushed her words, panic lacing her voice. "I went to the front office to make a call to the police, and when I came back, she was gone." Jim's heart pounded. His vision blurred with rage and fear. "Maya, they took her." Miss Florence's foot slammed on the brakes as she made a sharp U-turn. "Forget the police," she said. "We're going back." Jim barely heard her. His entire body burned with a single thought. "I'm coming, Maya. I'm coming." Jim and Miss Florence raced back to Hillcrest Academy. When they pulled into the parking lot, Miss Freya was already outside, her face pale, eyes red from panic. Jim jumped out of the car. "Where is she?" he demanded. Miss Freya shook her head. "I don't know. I checked everywhere. The bathrooms, the cafeteria. She's just gone." Jim's blood boiled. His hands curled into fists. They took her. The school board. The corrupt staff. The ones who had protected Robinson. They were desperate. Desperate enough to steal a child. Jim turned sharply. "I'm going inside." Miss Florence grabbed his arm. "Jim, wait. We have to be careful." "I don't have time to be careful," Jim growled. "Maya is missing." Miss Freya swallowed hard. Then she nodded. "I'll check the security room," she said. "Maybe the cameras caught something." Miss Florence sighed, rubbing her forehead. "I'll call the police again. They can't ignore this." Jim didn't wait. He turned and marched inside the school. Jim moved through the empty hallways, his breath short, his chest tight. His mind raced. Where would they take her? Who took her? His first instinct was Principal Robinson. But no, he was gone, which meant someone else was involved. Jim's eyes narrowed. He thought back to the men standing near the school gate. The ones from the school board. They had seen him leave. And the moment he was gone, Maya vanished. Jim's pulse pounded. They were watching him. They wanted to shut Maya up. They wanted to erase the last piece of evidence. Jim clenched his jaw. "Not on my watch." Then Jim heard it. A muffled cry. Jim froze. He turned his head, straining his ears. It was faint, but it was real. A soft whimper. Coming from? Jim's eyes locked on the janitor's closet. His chest tightened. He ran. He grabbed the handle. Locked. Jim's rage exploded. He took a step back, then slammed his shoulder against the door. It shook, but didn't break. Then he heard her, a small, trembling voice. Jim, Maya. Jim's lungs burned. I'm here, kid, he said. Step back. Then he threw his weight against the door again. Crack. The lock snapped. The door burst open. Jim's heart clenched. Maya was inside, tied to a chair, her face streaked with tears. The second she saw him, she let out a broken sob. Jim! Jim rushed forward, untying the ropes around her wrists and ankles. His hands shook with rage. Who did this to you? He whispered. Maya hiccuped, her small body shaking. They said I had to go away, she whimpered. They said if I stayed, I'd get you in trouble. Jim's stomach twisted. These monsters, they were threatening a child. Maya's fingers clutched his sleeve. They said no one would believe me, she whispered. Jim closed his eyes. Then he opened them, and they burned with pure fire. I believe you, he said. Then footsteps, fast, heavy, coming toward them. Jim's head snapped up. They weren't alone. The ones who took Maya, they were coming back. Jim pulled Maya into his arms. Hold on tight, he murmured. Then he turned, ready to fight. Jim stood in front of Maya, his heart pounding like a war drum as the footsteps grew closer. He could feel Maya's small hands gripping his sleeve, her body trembling against him. Whoever had locked her in here, they were coming back. Jim braced himself. Then the door flew open. 2 men stormed in. Jim recognized them immediately. School board security. The same men who had been waiting at the school gate earlier. The taller one, a bald man with a thick neck, froze when he saw Jim standing there, Maya clinging to him. The other one, a stocky man with cold, dark eyes, cursed under his breath. Jim's hands curled into fists. You put your hands on a child, Jim said, his voice low, dangerous. You locked her in a closet. Neither of them denied it. The stocky one took a slow step forward. This doesn't concern you, janitor, he said. Walk away. Jim felt his blood boil. Walk away? After everything? After Maya had been hurt, threatened, terrified? He let out a short, humorless laugh. You think I'm going to walk away? Jim asked. After what you did to her? The taller one sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, he muttered. We don't want trouble. Just hand the girl over and leave. Jim's vision burned red. Hand. The girl. Over. Like she was property. Maya whimpered, burying her face against Jim's side. Jim had heard enough. He took a slow step forward, shielding Maya behind him. If you want her, he said, his voice like steel, you're going to have to go through me. The stocky man's eyes darkened. Jim saw the shift. This man was used to getting his way, and Jim had just told him no. The man's jaw tensed. And then he lunged. Jim moved fast. He ducked. The man's fist swung through empty air. Then Jim struck. A solid punch to the ribs. The stocky man stumbled back, gasping. The bald one cursed and charged. Jim had no time to think. He grabbed the janitor's mop from the closet corner and swung it hard. Crack! The mop handle snapped against the bald man's knees. He yelped, collapsing to the floor. The stocky man recovered, charging again. Jim dodged just barely. The man's fist clipped his shoulder, sending a jolt of pain down his arm. But Jim didn't stop. He twisted, bringing up his elbow. Slam! Right into the man's jaw. The stocky man staggered backward, swaying. Jim grabbed Maya's hand tightly. Run, he shouted. They bolted. Jim pulled Maya down the hallway, his pulse roaring in his ears. Behind them, the security men stumbled after them. But Jim was faster. Maya was small, and they knew every hallway, every turn. Jim's legs burned as they raced through the school, past empty classrooms and abandoned lockers. Then, a voice boomed through the intercom. Stop them! Jim's heart clenched. That was the school board director. And that meant Everyone still loyal to the school's corruption would be after them. Miss Florence, Miss Freya, Eileen. They needed help. Then Jim saw it. A pair of double doors leading outside. The parking lot. Their escape. Jim gritted his teeth. They were almost there. Then a security guard stepped in front of the doors. Jim skidded to a stop. The guard smirked. "You're not going anywhere." Jim looked around wildly. Another hallway. A stairwell. A classroom. Trapped. Maya tightened her grip on his sleeve. Jim's mind raced. They were outnumbered. And then a sound. Loud. Sharp. A police siren. The security guard froze. Jim's eyes widened. The doors burst open, and police officers poured in. Guns drawn. Badges flashing. And leading them was the detective from earlier. The one Jim had spoken to at the station. His sharp eyes locked onto Jim and Maya. "Jim," he called. "You okay?" Jim let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Yeah," he panted. "But they tried to take Maya." The detective's face darkened. He turned to the school board security. "Everyone on the ground." The men hesitated. Then one by one, they dropped their weapons and raised their hands. The detective gestured for Jim and Maya to come forward. Jim picked Maya up, cradling her against his chest. And then they walked out, through the doors, into the fresh air, and away from the nightmare of Hillcrest Academy. The next day, Jim sat in the police station, the flash drive plugged into a computer monitor. Detectives, reporters, and child protection workers watched as the security footage played. And one by one, they saw everything. Principal Robinson, the school board's cover-ups, the mistreatment, the crimes hidden behind Hillcrest Academy's perfect reputation. Jim watched as the room fell into silence. Then the detective turned to him. "This is enough," he said. "More than enough." Jim felt something deep in his chest loosen. Maya's voice piped up beside him. "So, the bad guys go to jail now?" Jim smiled, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Yeah, kid," he said. "They do." The news spread like wildfire. TV reports, newspaper headlines, online articles. Elite school exposed for covering up years of abuse. Principal and school board members arrested after damning evidence surfaces. Hillcrest Academy, once seen as a prestigious institution, was now a disgrace. Parents pulled their kids. Sponsors withdrew funding. And within weeks, the school shut down. Jim watched the final news report on TV, sitting beside Maya, Miss Florence, and Miss Freya. Maya looked up at him, a small smile on her face. "We did it," she whispered. Jim let out a breath. For the first time in a long time, he felt peace. "Yeah, kid," he murmured. "We did." Jim sat on the front porch of Maya's house, a warm cup of coffee in his hands. The sky stretched above them, painted in soft hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. Maya sat beside him, her legs swinging off the edge of the wooden steps. She looked peaceful for the first time in days. It had been a long fight, but they had won. Hillcrest Academy was finished. The school board was dismantled. Principal Robinson and his co-conspirators were in jail, facing multiple charges of abuse, misconduct, and corruption. And Maya? She was finally safe. Jim looked down at her. She had been through so much, more than any child should ever have to endure. But somehow, she was still smiling. She looked up at him, her big brown eyes filled with curiosity. "So, what happens now?" she asked. Jim took a sip of his coffee, thinking. "I don't know, kid," he admitted. "But whatever it is, it's got to be better than what we left behind." Maya grinned. "You're not going back to cleaning floors, are you?" Jim chuckled. "Nah, I think I'm done with mops for a while." Miss Florence and Miss Freya stepped out of the house, joining them on the porch. "You know," Miss Freya said, crossing her arms, "you should be a teacher." Jim raised an eyebrow. "A teacher?" Miss Florence nodded. "You stood up for those kids. You protected them. You taught them something no classroom ever could." Jim scoffed. "I don't know the first thing about teaching." Maya nudged him playfully. "You taught me." Jim paused. He had, hadn't he? Not math or science or history, but something more important. He had taught her to fight back, to never let anyone silence her, to believe in herself. Jim exhaled, shaking his head with a small smile. Maybe I'll think about it. Miss Florence smirked. Good. Because there's a job opening at Maya's new school. Jim froze. Maya giggled. I think you'd be awesome, she said. Jim sighed, running a hand over his head. Well, he muttered, guess I'll need some new clothes then. Everyone laughed. The weight on Jim's shoulders lifted. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. And as the sun set behind them, Jim Carter knew this was just the beginning. 1 year later, Jim adjusted the collar of his shirt, standing in front of a classroom full of eager new students. The chalkboard behind him read, Mr. Carter, Social Studies. He took a deep breath, looking out at the young faces watching him expectantly. All right, class, he said with a small grin. Let's talk about justice.